says, with great power comes great responsibility. I love Spider-Man, and one of the reasons I love Spider-Man is because it teaches me great lessons that I can apply in my own life. Like, with great power comes great responsibility, and all about sacrifice and love, and then also how cool it is to wear red and blue lycra. But one of the things I love the most about the latest Spider-Man movie, No Way Home, is the lesson about how we can forget our past and move forward and step into our future. If you've seen the trailer and all you need to see is the trailer, no spoilers here, you know that it's all about how our friendly neighborhood Spider-Man, Peter Parker's name has just gone out to the rest of the world. Everyone knows who he is, but he's also become public enemy #1. He needs to rewrite his own story because his past has left him really messy in his present circumstances. But his past mistakes hasn't just left himself in a messy predicament, it's also left his friends and family too. So who else does he go to but Doctor Strange to cast a spell to help him and help everyone forget that he's really Spider-Man? But as we all know, in any movie where the future's gonna change and where we want more control, things get messy and messier, and well, I'll leave the rest of the movie for you to watch. But today, the big thing I want to explore with you is what we can do when our past becomes a problem for our future. Welcome to Beyond at Home. And whilst I'm sure maybe you can think of a time in your life where you just wish you could rewrite the story, you have your own past regrets, I know that we don't have a Doctor Strange like Spider-Man and Peter Parker does. But I'm sure you have a moment in your life you can think of that you just wish wasn't part of your story. Or that feeling that you felt where you just know that you never want to feel that again, and yet it's popped back up into your present. It's popped back up into your present. And when our past catches up to our presence and we start feeling the same feelings again, it's yuck and it's messy, it's so easy for us to want more control over what's going on. It's really easy for us to kind of rest on our defensive reflexes, you know, those things that allow us to feel a little bit more in control. For some of us, we deflect the pain from our past or the regrets of our past by turning to humor or sarcasm. For some of us, we become really critical, we become really angry, and we bottle it all up inside of us. For some of us, we withdraw, we run away from other people that we know might actually help us at the end of the day and move past our past. Or for some of us, we've just become control freaks. We start micromanaging and taking on too much. You see, even with our defensive reflexes to try and manage our past so that we can step into the future, at the end of the day, we create our own mess because we try and fix it by ourselves. You see, our past becomes a problem when it creates fear for our future and a fear for our future relationships. Sometimes we actually have to look back in order to move forward from our past to get a little bit of perspective. There's one thing that I learned in my time when I was working up at a campsite where I was an instructor on a flying fox. It's that for some people to conquer that fear of not knowing what something might be or what the outcome of something might be, for some people to conquer that fear, they actually need to see others experience it for themselves. They need to see or even hear a little bit more about their story. I want to share with you a story today that I think can help us actually address how we can respond to this fear of our future and the fear and anxiety that comes from our past. So this story is about a guy named Onisimus. And Onisimus, he's not from this time, he's from a couple of thousand years back, but Onisimus was actually a slave, right? In fact, he was a runaway slave. He stole from his master, Philemon. But what you need to know about Onisimus is that even though his name sounds awesome and he kind of sounds like a gladiator, is that he was in a real predicament because the reason he had run away from Philemon is that he had stolen from him. And the thing about Philemon that you need to know is that from everything that scholars know is that Philemon was actually a follower of Jesus. But at this time in history, I know you might be thinking it's a little bit bizarre that he has slaves. Like, how does that work? In the culture of the time, unfortunately, slavery was just really common. But you see, Onisimus has run away and he goes to Rome, which would have been a really good place to hide. And whilst Onisimus is kind of being Jason Bourne in Rome and trying to hide from Philemon, from being caught, he comes across a man named Paul, who's in jail. Onisimus becomes friends with Paul. And what you need to know about Paul is that Paul is actually the Paul that we talk about, who's in the history books is one of the biggest influences of the Jesus movement post-Jesus himself. See, Paul and Onisimus, they build this really awesome friendship and connection to the point where Paul even kind of refers to as Onisimus as his son. And this is what Onisimus might not have known, is that Paul was actually really good friends with Philemon. See, the reason Paul was in jail is because of his faith and how he practiced it. But he's good mates with Philemon, so he actually decides to write a letter to Philemon. And it's a letter telling Philemon about Onisimus, about how he can move on from his past and how Philemon can accept him and help him step into the future. And this is what he has to write. He says this. He says, Philemon, formerly Onisimus, he was useless to you. He was a slave, he'd run away from you, he'd stolen from you. But now he's become useful. He started to explore more about who he is, coming to understand more about faith in his conversations with Paul. And so, Paul says, I'm sending him, who is my very heart, back to you. Perhaps the reason he was separated from you for a little while was that you might have him back forever. And this is what Paul says. Have him back forever, but no longer as a slave, but better than a slave, as a dear brother. See, Onesimus' past had him trapped. He was a slave to his fear of ever returning. He was a slave to his past mistakes, the shame, the regret, and the guilt, these three master emotions that led him to withdraw and run away from the mistake that he had made. But what Paul says to Philemon is that Onesimus is no longer a slave. He's no longer a slave to his fear or to his anxiousness. See, Paul writes to say, so if you consider me a friend, if you consider me a partner, Philemon, welcome Onesimus home as you would welcome me. And then this is the big thing. He says, if he has done any wrong to you or owes you anything, charge it to me. He says, if he owes you anything, he has to repay you anything. Paul says, charge it to me. And this is really this beautiful packaged up version of the Christian message, right? Of this hope to the world, of what Jesus did on the cross. And the bottom line of it is that Jesus freed and frees people who are a slave to themselves and to their past by paying the debt that couldn't be paid on its own. See, the fears of our past will tell us that we are unforgivable, that we are unlovable, and at times it can tell us that we are useless. And by that stage, we're just a lost cause. The shame, regret, and guilt can just build and build and build. But what we know is true is that we don't have to live in our past regrets and mistakes. For followers of Jesus and in the worldview of kind of Christianity, we're told that we can actually step into this free invitation of grace. And how do we know that? Well, we know that because of the story of Paul. See, Paul was in jail because of how he shared and practiced his faith. And Paul was so good at writing letters to a whole bunch of different churches, church communities to spread this message of hope to the world. He was one of the biggest influences of the Jesus movement. But before that, Paul was actually a man, before he became a follower of Jesus and met the risen Jesus, Paul was a man who terrorized Christians. He locked up children and family. He actually arranged for Christians to be killed. He was a religious terrorist. But what we see is the life transformation of Paul. Paul's very own story is a testimony that your past doesn't disqualify you from your future. That you can actually step into your future knowing that you're stepping into the full potential of who you've been called to be. And here's the thing, because our past pain can actually lead to growth. It does lead to growth. And just like any director or author of Paul's story, if they were sitting in the chair and conducting the song, or more so directing the story of Paul, they would have just said he should have been ruled out. There was no way he could have repaid those families, those people. He couldn't bring people back to life. He should have been disqualified from any future. And yet he was used by God in a most miraculous way. Our past pain can lead to growth. When we put ourselves in a spot where we overcome those little fears, when we take the next step with the courage and boldness to actually step into our future, we have an opportunity to learn more about ourselves, more about others, and I think more about God. We think about the story of Paul, and we think about the unique story of Spider-Man, of Peter Parker, and the lessons they had to learn along the way. This is all part of the hero's tale. This is all part of my journey and your journey too, what we can learn from the past and what we can do in order to respond to our future calling. And I think there's a couple ways that we can go about doing that. I think one way, first off, is to actually identify what our defensive reflex is when it comes to the fears of our past. How do we respond immediately when that shame, guilt, regret starts seeping in and leaking into our brain, when it starts causing us to have a foggy mind, when we feel the heartache again, when we just feel gross? How do you respond? Do you respond by withdrawing? Do you respond by becoming more of a control freak? Does the anger and frustration begin to bottle up? Do you withdraw? Do you run away? What does that look like to you? What's your defensive reflex? Identify your reflex, but from there, address it. address the past, address what it is. It might even mean writing down how you felt at that time and writing down how you feel right now, writing down the people that you think it affected. But then settle your past is the big number 3. To actually look at what you've written down or the things that you've thought about and say, hey, I actually need to forgive this person. I need to ask for forgiveness here. Maybe for you, it might be for the very first time, taking that to God and beginning a conversation with him. Because at the end of the day, when we are talking to God, he just wants your heart's attention. He doesn't want your perfection. Just don't let the experience of your past dictate to you how you can experience God and the future he's called you into. So at the end of the day, fear is just the antithesis to faith. And we've all placed our faith in something, if not someone. And whilst faith isn't knowing the end of the story, it is trusting in the one who does. We would all love clarity over our future. And I know we'd all love to be able to change things from our past in order to have the future that we want. But it's just not the case. We just can't control that. And that's where the anxiousness comes from. But we don't need to live any longer as a slave to fear. Because of what Jesus has done on the cross, his life, death, and resurrection, that's repaid. We don't need to live in the guilt, shame, and regret and identify it as our own self. We don't need to live any longer as a slave to fear, but we can experience the future that God has called us to live in.